Stop the world!
What they told us was we should prepare for the fact that within 4 years, 90% of what's on the internet will be fake. Within 1 year, 70% of what's generated for the internet will be generated by AI.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm David Rowe and I'm flying solo this week on the podcast. Let me start by repeating that figure we just heard because I can hardly believe my own ears. Tech companies have told NATO that within 4 years, 90% of what's on the internet will be fake. That is frightening stuff. And it's just the kind of challenge that we're going to be talking about in 6 weeks' time at the Sydney Dialogue. That's right. The countdown to ASPI's Cyber and Tech Conference is on. And to get everyone's minds focused, we've got our latest episode of the Sydney Dialogue Summit Sessions today. In the second interview of our series, ASPI's Executive Director Justin Bassi speaks with James Appathurai, NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Innovation, Hybrid and Cyber. The conversation covers a lot of ground. The gentlemen talk about the impact of technology on security, the growth of deep fakes, my favourite subject, artificial intelligence, and the risks all of these fast-developing technologies pose to democracies and elections. They also discuss the evolution of innovation and the complete turnaround in the role of the private sector.
It used to be that 80% of innovation came out of government or was contracted by government and 20% came out of the private sector. This is like 30, 40 years ago. Now that's flipped.
Justin and James also talk about the trends James is seeing in hybrid threat activity in Europe and how NATO countries and like-minded partners can respond.
What's new in Europe is we're seeing a lot more overt sabotage, and this is just over the last 6 months to 1 year, meaning physical attacks, physical damage, fires at logistical points, derailing of trains. Often this is intended to undermine practical support or political support to Ukraine.
Finally, James shares some fascinating stats on the increasing number and longevity of autocracies, which can be partly charted to surveillance technology. So I do encourage you to listen out for that section. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
James Appathurai, NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Innovation, Hybrid and Cyber. I'm absolutely delighted to have you on the ASPI podcast, Stop the World.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Wonderful. James, we met in Brussels just a couple of months ago, and I'm pleased to tell our listeners that you'll be joining us in Australia later this year for the Sydney Dialogue, ASPI's major summit on cyber and critical technologies. In the lead up to the dialogue, we're interviewing a few of our speakers, as well as other international guests who are unable to join us in Sydney this year. But James, once again, thank you for joining me. And to start off, before we dive into some more specific questions, your long title tells us that you are responsible for NATO's work on innovation, hybrid and cyber. It seems to cover a huge cross-section of both security challenges and opportunities, almost all of the modern-day threats. So can you tell us and our listeners a bit about your role and the specific threats on which you are focused?
Sure, and actually there's more than those three. We just couldn't fit any more on the big sign in front of the door of the division. So when I joined the division 3 years ago, it was actually called Emerging Security Challenges, but we changed the name after a year because they've all emerged. That's the bottom line. So I'll give you a little list, and it's quite wide, but you'll see how they all kind of fit together. One of them, as you mentioned, is innovation. So we have been trying to, on the one hand, foster the development and the acquisition of emerging and disruptive technologies, but also protect our ecosystem. And we can go into more detail if you wish, but that includes technologies like artificial intelligence, like quantum, like biotech, autonomous platforms, novel materials, etc. So that's the sort of the innovation track. And I'm happy to chat about how we're doing work in that area. Then there's hybrid. So different people use different words. The Brits, for example, talk about gray zone, but what we basically mean is hostile activities that are not or not exclusively sort of heavy metal fighting like you see in Ukraine, but it's things like cyber attacks, disinformation, sabotage, political interference, sabotage of our undersea or other critical infrastructure. So it's that constant pressure just below the threshold of armed conflict. So we're supposed to, in my division, help to deal with that. Cyber is a big part of that, but it's such a big part that it gets its own label on the door.
Yeah.
Heavy metal hostilities, they reach a certain threshold and then it's war. But cyberspace is contested at all times, from ransomware to sabotage to getting people's data and dumping it online. So this kind of cyber conflict is happening all the time, and we have to deal with it all the time. But then beyond those three, we also deal in the division with energy security and energy transition to make sure that we can maintain military effectiveness through the energy transition. We are dealing with the security implications of climate change, how to assess it, how to adapt to it, but also how to cut our greenhouse gas emissions on the military side. And finally, the new one, which is enhanced protection for critical undersea infrastructure. After the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline and Baltic connectors, some cuts to cables, and a determined Russian in particular program to map out our critical infrastructure, the member states decided we had to do more to secure it. So that put together is the portfolio that I deal with. Sorry for going on so long.
No, it's very important. And really what it shows, James, is that exactly how broad your remit is and how necessary that breadth is. Because everything we're dealing with these days, unfortunately, is not just a positive, but there comes a threat with that positive. That's the fact that we're in with technological advancement. Maybe do take us through what you're talking about on the innovation side, because I think most people thinking of a group like NATO or countries that we focus more on the defence side, as you call it, the heavy metal side. What do you mean by, on the innovation side, that you're endeavouring to protect the ecosystem?
So it's a great question. And, if probably 10, 15 years ago, a division like mine wouldn't have even existed, certainly not with that kind of a focus on innovation. So there's kind of three reasons why this is very high on the agenda for NATO now. One is, if you look in Ukraine, you can see that innovation is battle decisive. And when I mean innovation, I don't mean only sort of the traditional, you have an F-35, very advanced fighter. I mean the innovative identification and use of civilian or dual use, as we call it, technologies. The Ukrainians are outnumbered in every possible category, but they're holding their own in part because they are able to innovate. And I'll give you just one example. They are able to see what's going on the battlefield, what the Russians are up to, by fusing information from civilian satellites that were basically put up there to look at ice depths, but now can look at where the Russians are, with drones that people made in their basement and are providing information, with apps that they've given out to every Ukrainian to be able to provide real-time information, for example, when a drone goes by, to information they scraped off Russian Facebook to identify Russian faces, to unencrypted Russian communications using AI to translate it from Russian into Ukrainian. And all of this put through a task-oriented chatbot like ChatGPT, which then feeds them where the Russians are, where they're going, etc. So this is just an example of how innovation, rapid innovation, is really, really battle decisive. The second reason that we are more focused on this is China. China is doing extremely well when it comes to innovation in an era where we don't have, as the West, the best relations with the Chinese, and we call it strategic competition. And, I think it was your institute that came up with a tech tracker that put the Chinese ahead or even with us in 37 out of 44 emerging and disruptive technologies, and in some cases so far ahead that they have a monopolistic advantage. So, we have to take that into account. And then the third reason is the shift in where innovation is taking place. It used to be that 80% of innovation came out of government or was contracted by government, and 20% came out of the private sector. This is like 30, 40 years ago. Now that's flipped. It's 80% private sector, 20% government. And, if you look at your phone, most of the technologies in that phone, like everyone's like, oh, Steve Jobs, he's such a genius. And he was a genius. But the technologies are all stimulated by government, from the screen to the 3 different kinds of chips to GPRS to GPS to the use of the phone system, phone networks. This is all government sponsored, but those days are over now. So, for all these reasons, we decided we needed to lean in and foster our innovation ecosystem. That means, in particular, startups that face lack of funding. They go through what's called Death Valley. They come up with a great idea, they get a first round of funding, they get a second round of funding, but then they don't get the third, or they don't get enough to make it to being a viable company to scale up. So we created a structure to help them get the money, but also to be able to test their technology and learn how to scale up a company. And then we created a deep tech innovation fund, which should go up close to 1.5 billion US dollars in the coming months, so that we can make long-term bets, patient capital, the way the Chinese do it, on deep technologies that can have a strategic benefit. Things like AI, like quantum, like biotech. These are foundational technologies which then lead to all kinds of other development. So this is how we're leaning in on innovation.
James, I think that description sets out exactly why all nations and all groups should be adding innovation to their work, even if it doesn't quite fit the focus of innovation as a priority. Those three areas, innovation being battle decisive in war, the fact that China is advancing rapidly in technology and technology is at the heart of the strategic competition we have with China, and the shift we're seeing from government to commercial. Those three reasons should be listened to by all countries, all defence sectors, and your investment in that deep tech innovation fund is to your credit, taking that long-term bet in areas that a lot of us around the world can't get past the short term. So that is to your credit and exactly is what the innovation space is all about. Thank you for referencing ASPI's Critical Tech Tracker. It did indeed show that from research into technology, how advanced and how much of a lead China has on the rest of us. On the other side, the positive side, it does show the power of working together collectively. And particularly when you add in significant powers in the Indo-Pacific and significant European powers or groups like NATO, that's how you're able to compete and manage with that strategic competition. So moving from the innovation side to the threat side, as you said, dealing with a number of threats that have emerged now. Just a few years ago, they were beyond the horizon. They've well and truly emerged. Whether you call it grey zone or hybrid threats, it is a problem that democracies face, James, whether it be individual countries like Australia or groupings like NATO, in part because the public and indeed the political class don't always have a full understanding of what hybrid threats are. And if there's a lack of understanding, it then means it can be difficult to work out how to counter those threats. So can you explain for our listeners exactly what a hybrid threat is or what hybrid threats are and why they have become just so important and at times just as threatening to us as military conflict?
So, great question. And, you talked about lack of understanding, but I think there's a reason why people have a lack of understanding, which is one of the essential platforms or aims of hybrid attacks is that they are unclear, that they are undeniable, that they are spraying smoke around so that you don't quite know what happened, that it's not quite overt enough to provoke a reaction, that they don't quite know who did it, or that it's impossible to prove at 100% who did it, and there's a lot of disinformation around it. So it works in part because it is deniable, or at least mildly plausibly deniable. But what sort of things do I mean? So first, and these things often go together. I think what's really important to understand is that, of course, we focus a lot on Russia. You guys probably have other actors more in mind, but I'll come to that. Russia has a very clear, focused strategy to use all instruments of state power, so not just military, but everything, to achieve strategic effect. And they have created a headquarters, for example, to do this, where all the different government ministries come together. It's in Moscow, and they can pull all the levers they want to achieve the effect that they want. And this isn't like some secret piece of information. You can just Google it. They give tours of it, so they're not hiding it at all. But what does it mean? So deliberate cyber attacks. And the cyber attacks have many motivations. We all experience them, but I'll mention just one, for example, and that is a lot of the ransomware attacks that we see in all of our countries are also cover for political activities and often to implant malware into critical infrastructure and in particular into industrial control systems so that this hostile actor can, whenever it wishes, turn the key and prevent a piece of critical infrastructure from operating properly. I'll give you a recent example, which people find interesting. One of the major ports here in Europe had a days-long cyber fight with a major state actor because that major state actor was trying to lock a warship from one of the NATO countries between two of the locks it was transiting through, drain the water, and drop the ship. I mean, I have 100 examples like this. But these sort of ongoing cyber attacks is one thing. Second is disinformation. I don't think Australia needs any lessons in the challenges of disinformation. Then there's political interference. You guys get it all the time. We have very recently had the European Parliament complain about the Russians trying to influence European parliamentarians. In my country, we've had pressure on, sorry, I'm Canadian, pressure on our Chinese diaspora. We also had a major cyber attack on the SPD party in Germany. So, there's a very long list when it comes to political interference. Then there's forced migration. Countries like Finland, countries like Estonia have faced a substantial number of migrants basically bussed to and pushed across their borders, like constant pressure, again, by the Russians to destabilize, to create disquiet. What's new in Europe is we're seeing a lot more overt sabotage, and this is just over the last 6 months to 1 year, meaning physical attacks, physical damage, fires at logistical points, derailing of trains. Often this is intended to undermine practical support or political support to Ukraine. But what the Russians are doing is recruiting criminal gangs or other proxies in our countries to carry out their activities. We kicked out a whole bunch of Russian so-called diplomats, but who were basically intelligence officers a few years ago. They have reconstituted different ways to carry out sabotage in our countries. So it's a sort of constant needling pressure. It can go up and down. The challenge that we have, all of us have, is to connect the dots. It can look like whack-a-mole. I don't know if you have whack-a-mole in Australia.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
yeah, okay. Part of our job here at NATO is to tell the individual allies, okay, this is happening in your country and that's happening in your country. Let's paint the big picture because then we start to get an idea. There's only one actor behind it, maybe two. So they have a strategy that is comprehensive. We need to have an overview that is comprehensive. But then we also need to look for what I call, and I guess all of us call, the boiling frog problem. Like, we can't just get used to it. We have to look at trends because it's going up and it's getting worse. And so we need to know what's happening so we can respond to it, both by having better resilience and by imposing costs. So that's how we look at the hybrid challenge.
It's fantastic. And unfortunately, sometimes it does feel that we are the frog being boiled while playing whack-a-mole and not realizing that we're being boiled. So it's multiple problems. As you say, there are a couple of major actors in this area, Russia and China. Clearly for NATO, Russia's the ongoing top priority, the number one threat. It's what you're describing. The complexity is that we are actually in a war. Russia has militarily invaded Ukraine and NATO has to deal with that. But then you're describing so many other elements, from political interference, forced migration, sabotage, that are below that military level. Take us through a little bit more of what you're seeing there, particularly on the sabotage side, which does seem to be a focus for NATO. What is that Russian activity? And James, what is their ultimate goal there? Is it short-term disruption, or are they looking to test vulnerabilities for preparation to help them with their future conflict aims?
Great question. So we have seen, for example, an increase. I mean, this is the most brutal in assassinations. And that started, I think, the Skripal case in the UK was well known around the world, but there was cases in Germany and elsewhere where this is happening. Then attacks on politicians and attacks on politicians' property, like a Baltic politician whose car was burned. Then, as I mentioned, derailment of trains, for example, in the Netherlands, trains that were important for logistical support for supplies going to Ukraine, bus stations burned, and a lot of threat. So these are just some of the examples of the harder sabotage elements. And I mentioned some of the other things. But what we see is an uptick. And as I mentioned, this is through the use of proxies and recruitment of criminal gangs in our countries. So that sort of harder edged activity is on the upswing. And I think it's important to note this is nothing new for the Russians. They have done this for decades in Western Europe. It has gone up and down. It went down briefly. Now it's back. And this is part of a consolidation of intelligence activities as part of the Russian regime. We all know that President Putin is a former KGB officer, but what we have seen over the past 20 years is that the FSB and the GRU in particular have really consolidated their positions as dominant power players in Russia. What we've seen recently is that they are cooperating more together. So the intelligence services are getting stronger in Russia, and they're getting more coordinated in Russia, and their activities in our countries are becoming more sustained and at a higher level of risk for us. So the aims, as I mentioned, are twofold. One is to interfere with support for Ukraine. And of course, Poland faces a huge intelligence challenge because it's the main conduit for support into Ukraine. It's right next to Ukraine. And so the Russians target it. But the Poles are extremely good at watching their own territory, and they get support from others as well. So they're taking steps to secure it. But the threat is very real, and the activities are very real. So that's one reason. But second is to create disquiet. It's to create worry. It's to create destabilization.
Yeah.
And the Russian aim is, of course, to see political instability in the West. That serves their purposes. If people feel unhappy with their governments, then, of course, it interferes with the political system. It feeds the populist right, which is not doing so badly in Europe these days, because the populist right can say, look what they're doing, the government. They can't secure you, or you're not secure because of their position on Ukraine. So this is all part of a coordinated effort.
Yeah, that undermining of trust, which is so vital for the resilience of our societies. It brings me to the topic of deterrence, James, which of course should never have been out of vogue, but has come back into focus with the actual military side to the conflict. NATO and other countries responded so strongly to that invasion, and everybody agreed and focused on re-establishing deterrence in that military domain. But from what you're describing, it really does paint the picture that we have been beaten for many years in the space below the military level, and whether it be cyber attacks or foreign interference, or in this region, James, China's bullying of the Philippines in the South China Sea at a collision level, at a violent and aggressive and intimidation level, but not quite at the military level. Do you think we've got a problem with a lack of deterrence for hybrid threats? And do you think that we need to reconstruct our understanding of deterrence to make sure that we're not just aiming to avoid future military conflict, but to avoid being beaten and, as you say, undermined at a level lower than military?
Yeah, great question. And we debate that all the time. So I'd say a couple of things. One is military deterrence is the foundation. You need to have military deterrence. So we have invested very heavily in that, and I won't run through all the numbers, but we are absolutely sure that when it comes to force on force, we have effective deterrence. And you can see that the Russians are staying well away from NATO, despite all of the complications that we have when it comes to military deterrence, because they don't want this fight, and they don't want this fight because they know they'll lose it. But when it comes to the hybrid threat, I think it's really important to note that for us, there is actually an imbalance of vulnerability. Meaning, Russia, for example, has closed off its information space. It has created a great firewall, very similar to what the Chinese have, and getting better and better, including using Chinese tech and Chinese techniques. There is no opposition to speak of. There are no independent think tanks to speak of. If anybody tries to demonstrate or even thinks about it, they're picked off. So their information space is secure. It's not a place I'd want to be, but it's secure from a Kremlin point of view. Ours is, of course, democratic and open, so vulnerable. Second, on energy and energy infrastructure, Russia is a gigantic petrol station. It doesn't have a reliance on a web of pipelines and cables and liquid natural gas shipping and ports that we depend on for our energy simply by virtue of geography and the way that, we live. So there again, there's an imbalance of vulnerability. Cyber is the same because they have installed all kinds of firewalls on all of their servers. There's a particular government ministry in Russia, the name of which I never pronounce correctly, so I won't, but they've done it, et cetera, et cetera. So they can come into our country pretty easily. It's very difficult for us to go into theirs. So for all of the other activities that flow from that. So I think we have to recognize the imbalance of vulnerability. So what do we do about it? So the way we look at deterrence here in NATO is twofold, and I mentioned it briefly. One is deterrence by denial, meaning you are resilient, and so the attacker's attacks will fail. So what are we doing about that? So for example, in cyber, NATO, like the EU, encourages its member states to raise their standards when it comes to cyber defense. And we have here in NATO, for example, asked the allies to agree, and they did, to a high standard when it comes to cyber protection of critical infrastructure. And we gave them sort of a standard to meet and steps to get there and ideas how to get there. And that's just one of many steps. So that's in one space, which is the cyberspace. When it comes to critical undersea infrastructure, we've just set up a network with all the major energy providers. We've set up a cell in one of our headquarters so that we can exchange data, exchange threat warnings, and employ our military more effectively to help provide better security for critical undersea infrastructure. All of our countries are working with the media and with social media companies to try to enhance, resilience in that area, try to promote media literacy, try to debunk and counter Russian messaging. We are working with the political parties. I think Australia is doing exactly the same things. So building up societal resilience, we have something called baseline requirements that all allies sign up to make sure that the civilian world is resilient. And then there's the question, which is harder, of how do you respond? Deterrence by response, imposing a cost. What we don't want to do is automatically respond like for like. So cyber attack on us, we cyber attack you. No. We want a more sophisticated way of doing it. We also want a way that's in line with our values without being naive and in line with international law. That's not being naive, that we're going to stick to. So, for example, when we thought that Russian intelligence activities were getting to be too much in our countries, as I mentioned, all the allies got together and we kicked out dozens and dozens of Russian intelligence operatives from across NATO countries, and that had a clear effect in diminishing the activities that they have carried out. Many NATO countries have taken steps to limit the access of media that we consider to be just disinformation from Russia into our markets. So there is a limited series of steps you can take to respond. It can be, of course, economic sanctions, and that's one of the biggest tools that we have used to respond to Russian malign activities. So deterrence by denial, resilience, and deterrence by response, active imposition of cost.
Yeah, excellent description again. And going back to what you said about our vulnerabilities, I think what it takes for governments, the defence sector all round, is just an acknowledgement and acceptance that we don't, unfortunately, we don't have a level playing field. And that's across the board, whether it's how we use technology. We tend to use technology on the basis of principles and, as you say, following international rules. Well, our adversaries like Russia and China don't. We've got to be alive to that. It's interesting, James, when you talk about needing to determine how to respond to such malicious activity. And I like how you said you need to have a sophisticated response. I think that too often democratic countries don't use that terminology that you just have around necessarily having a response and for it to be sophisticated. We too often, I think, show the likes of Russia and China that when they carry out malicious activity, we don't want to escalate. We don't want to do something in response that escalates. And that, I think, presents a problem for us because Russia and China perceive that our response may be weak. What you set out is not a fear of escalation response, but a sophisticated response that could very well be like for like, but also asymmetric from our own perspective. Is it an important part of the NATO work that you do that of course, needs to be sophisticated and proportionate, but not to show adversaries that we fear escalation when it comes to responding to malicious activity?
I think things have really changed in the last few years
Yeah.
here in NATO. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think I've been here a long time, and there have been many views about Russia within the alliance. Countries that have had long-standing historical affinities to or ties to or positive previous relationships with Russia meant that we had really a range of views about what Russian activities might be, what their motivations could be, and whether you could really talk to them, whether they
Yeah.
would abide by. That's gone,
Mm.
or at least almost entirely gone. Everybody understands now that Europe has a Russia problem. The biggest country in the world, nuclear armed, hostile, expansionistic, I would say paranoid about the West's, or what they call the collective West's intentions towards
Yeah.
them, and imperialistic. There's very, very little debate about that anymore. As a result, it's a lot easier to take decisions together about what we need to do to defend ourselves and to respond. However, going beyond that, that we are going to have, this is me speaking, not NATO speaking.
Yeah.
We're going to have some very difficult debates about where the lines are, about what we're willing to accept in terms of how we interpret our values. So let me just give you an example. In the Baltic states, they have been subjected to Russian disinformation, targeting their minorities, using Russian media to create disquiet and political discord in their countries. And in some cases, they said, okay, enough is enough. We're cutting off access of Russian media into our market because it is not just a different range of views, it's active disinformation with a political aim. And other NATO countries that haven't had this experience, they say, yeah, but what about democracy? What about free speech? There are always limits to free speech. So the question is, where do you draw those lines? And we have to have some very, very difficult discussions, because if we stick to our principles to their absolute nth degree of interpretation, they can be instrumentalized against us and we lose. And you cannot win by playing defense all the time. You have to also lean a little bit forward on offense to impose costs on those who are trying to impose costs on you. So these are some of the tough discussions we have to have, and nations have to make their own decisions as individual countries, but also within the EU and within NATO in the context of the Euro-Atlantic area.
Really well said. And I think that if you accept that we're in some form of competition, then it has to flow from that you can't only play defense, as you said. There has to be a combination of offense and defense. And I really like what you're talking about there of we owe it to ourselves in the liberal democratic world to have those debates on where the lines are. If we don't know where the lines are, then inevitably other countries will push and push and push, and we won't ever reach that threshold until it's too late. So the key there for me is actually to have the debates, and everything you described, the need to have the conversations and actually work closely with social media companies, notwithstanding all the problems we have with social media companies, the absolute need to have increased media literacy in our society. All these things that you talk about are just as relevant for a country like Australia and the Indo-Pacific as they are throughout the transatlantic. So, that is another really important element of hybrid threats and the use of technology, is that they break down geographic distance. It is something that resonates in all regions. So do you think, James, that countries like Australia and Japan in this region, who aren't formal partners of NATO, should be doing more with European partners and vice versa to collectively counter these threats that we're facing?
So I think the general view of most countries, probably all countries in NATO, is that the democratic countries need to hold hands a bit tighter, be active together, because there is a bit of a different team, not just being formed, but getting stronger, which is illiberal, autocratic. They've got a team captain, which is China. Russia is a major participant in this team. And these are countries that have a very different vision of the world. And it's not a vision of the world that we share or that we want. And I don't mean the rise of China as an economic or political power. It
Yeah.
has every right to be a strong country. It has been for 500 years. And it is, from an economic point of view, rising back to where it has been for centuries, not rising above where it should be. Nobody disputes that. But what we see in the world, and it's very interestingly linked to technology, is increasing autocracy. So until about 2004, 2005, the number of autocracies in the world was going down, and the duration of autocracies was relatively short, something like 10 years. Since 2004, 2005, and the advent of surveillance technology and China exporting surveillance technology in particular, the number of autocracies has gone back up, number of democracies has gone down. The duration of autocracies has gone from 10 years to 25 years. The countries that are autocratic and using surveillance tech, generally, as I say, exported by China and having their technicians trained by China and often in China, the number of demonstrations has gone down, sometimes to zero. So there is a clear shift. And then this group of countries coordinates their activities in UN bodies when it comes to Ukraine, in technical bodies where technical standards are set, for example, for 5G, 6G, 7G. And all of this has implications for our security and our political security. So for all these reasons, we do want to cooperate together with democratic countries that share our fundamental values. Obviously, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea are those countries, but it is up to them, of course, to wish to cooperate with us. And if they do, we are definitely interested in areas like the ones that we already mentioned. So, for example, innovation, climate, cyber defense, or on major international issues like Ukraine, where we may wish to discuss together and have common positions about international security. So I think we're very open to deeper cooperation. And I expect that at the Washington summit that we're having, we only have about one per year. So they're a big deal for us. And having it in Washington always sort of raises the profile a little bit more. That's going to happen in a couple of weeks. And I expect that cooperation with our Indo-Pacific partners will be an important part of that.
Do you think, James, that the on-again, off-again conversation about a NATO liaison office in Tokyo might be discussed, at least in the margins of the NATO summit, or that might be one on hold for a little while?
Well, I am quite convinced that our cooperation with Japan, for example, has all kinds of legs. Whether or not we have an office there, I think is not going to change much at all. It had a lot of symbolism around it, but in terms of the practical cooperation, we're perfectly capable of getting on with that. We have what we call a contact point embassy. They do public diplomacy, not practical cooperation, but a NATO country represents NATO in all of our partner countries, and that's the case in Japan as well. So we're not too worried that we have problems chatting with the Japanese.
Yeah, no, they've really increased their investment in defence and security in recent years. It's interesting the way you described those group of autocracies. I'm sure it will be a major part of that NATO summit as well. But China continues to pretend that it's part of the international system while being, as you described, being the captain of a team that actually is undermining that very system. So we've seen Russia and China work together in this region as well, not just China amplifying Russia's messages in relation to the Ukraine war, but we've seen them in recent times leading into the Solomon Islands election here, James, working together to amplify each other's disinformation. The communication that we are talking about effectively in terms of how to combat a lot of these hybrid threats, to me, the best way to counter disinformation is to either pre-bunk and debunk it all with accurate information. But how important do you think the role of official spokesperson is? I should tell our listeners that one of your previous roles was as NATO spokesperson. We regularly hear from that type of role at NATO. We regularly hear from the US State Department or Pentagon spokespeople. But it's less common out here in Australia, where ministers tend to do the speaking and there aren't official positions of spokespeople. Can you take our listeners through why these roles exist, what their benefits are, and potentially the ability to simultaneously allow strong messages to be given by people below the leadership level, while also allowing room for escalation to that prime ministerial or presidential level should it be required?
Nobody ever asks about why that role is around. But I'd say there's probably two or three reasons why we think it's a useful role. One is that we have, at least in Brussels, the biggest press corps in the world. It's bigger than Washington, but it's relevant everywhere. The boss, whoever she or he is, and certainly in NATO, simply doesn't have time to answer even, a minor fraction of the demand. So when I was in the job and the current spokesperson, she and I, we can be there all the time. And, the Secretary General, for all of his affection, let's say for Bulgaria, does not have the time to deal with a documentary from Bulgarian TV7 all the time, but they have a legitimate right to ask the question. So that's one function, which is just a constant supply of information to an interested media. Second, from a more tactical point of view, as you pointed out, it's escalation. And that is when I, as spokesman, gave information. Yeah, it was interesting, and that's nice. But when the Secretary General speaks, it has political impact. And we wanted to use it in the right way and at the right time for the boss to have impact. But then the third reason is, let's face it, is to be a sacrificial lamb also. And that is if there's a tough message to be delivered and all the heat to be received by let's say, a member state who doesn't like the message or a partner who doesn't like the message, well, sometimes it's easier to send out poor James who can take all the grief. And I did it a couple of times, including with my own country when they pulled out of the Afghanistan mission. And that was just fine. That's part of the role. It's extremely interesting. It's one of the, I'd say, two or three jobs in NATO where you really know everything that's happening everywhere, because you have to know, because you cannot say something which might undermine something that's going on behind the scenes of which you were unaware. So you have to be aware of everything. So it's a lot of fun and a little bit tiring, but I would recommend it, frankly, to most leaders. I think it takes a lot of burden off their shoulders and allows for, in many ways, more effective communications.
I completely agree. We're almost out of time. We could talk for hours on this. Just a couple of final questions for you, James. Talking about communication, which is, of course, so vital for democracies. This year, 2024, is being referred to as the year of elections. Between 2 and 4 billion people going out to vote. Many of the elections are real. Some, like Russia's, of course, are not. Where do you see in your role the issue of disinformation and deepfakes in election campaigns and for elections? Is it part of what you group within the hybrid threat category? And with the advancement of technology supercharged by AI, is it inevitable that we are going to just see more and more disinformation online? Or are there key ways that we can actually counter what's going on?
I would say we have really fundamental reasons to be worried. First, internet made transmission of information globally free. Now AI has made the creation of content, any kind of content, free. So put those two things together and think that part through. Second, we had a bunch of tech companies come in here at very high level, the ones you all know. And we asked them about this. What they told us was we should prepare for the fact that within 4 years, 90% of what's on the internet will be fake. Within 1 year, 70% of what's generated for the internet will be generated by AI. That's in 1 year. So imagine what that does to political discourse, to your ability to believe anything that you see on any kind of screen. We also know that we can already see in many countries, actually, and we just spoke, for example, to our friends from Moldova. They have an election and a referendum coming up, and they are already experiencing deepfakes. We've had them in Slovakia. We've had them in my country, had them in the United States. So people are not yet ready for deepfakes in their minds, but they are here. I would add that this is particularly a problem when you go to countries and into languages where they have not until now experienced the kind of fake information that in particular the English-speaking world has experienced, where the populations have had a few years to get used to the fact that what they're seeing in front of them might not be true. And there's a certain amount of insulation, mental insulation. That's not the case for a lot of the world where, if you spoke Tagalog, nobody was deep faking in Tagalog, but now you can, but they're not insulated on that. The final point I would make is how we respond, because you talked about pre-bunking and debunking. What the tech firms told us was very interesting. They've conducted a lot of experiments. And what they tell us is pre-bunking and debunking is only effective in a very limited way. Why? It's volume. They brought in, hundreds of people, conducted experiments where for 100 days, I just give you one example. These are a range of people, including very well-educated people, less well-educated people. They bombarded them with the same message, fake video. But every day they told them before showing them the video, what you're about to see is fake. What you are about to see is not true. But by the end of the 100 days, all of the people watching this video believed what they had seen. So just telling people once what you're about to see is not true doesn't have the cognitive effect to counter the unending volume, the stream of false information. So we need to respond not just with debunking and pre-bunking, but with debunking and pre-bunking at the volume of relevance, which is to keep going to counter the fire hose of disinformation that we are going to be getting increasingly because, as I mentioned, AI makes it free to create.
Really well said. Some quite terrifying stats, James, if you say that in the not too distant future, 90% of information online is going to be fake and 70% of it generated by AI. A lot of these issues that you're referring to, the topics, the stats, the examples, only a few years ago would have seemed like science fiction to people. And I'm sure there is now an element of truth being stranger than science fiction. But I often ask guests on the ASPI podcast to inform their listeners what they are either currently reading or have read that's interesting in their field of interest and expertise. So whether it be an excellent piece of science fiction or non-fiction on these issues, is there a book that you'd recommend our listeners go out and read and both be alert, alarmed, informed and terrified?
Yeah, usually I end up in the alarmed and terrified part of the bookstore. Let me give you two. One, which I really opened my eyes, it's called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And it's by a guy named Peter Pomerantsev, who is, I think, probably the world's acknowledged leader now or expert on disinformation. And he knows everything about, in particular, Russian and other disinformation activities. And the point of the title is that the main aim of a lot of disinformation is not to convince you that the malign actor's view is correct. It's to confuse you into not believing anything at all, that nothing is true. Anything could be true. Everything is a view. My nephew, who's, a lot younger than me, obviously, he thinks that way. It's always an opinion because he doesn't know what's true anymore. When the Russians shot down the Malaysian aircraft, MH17, they put out 34 different theories of what could have been the origin within a few days. And the aim wasn't to convince you that it wasn't them. It was to make you not believe anything. So that's one book. It's really, really worth reading. And you can see echoes of it now in a lot of politicians' activities. The second, and obviously this does fall into the depressing category, is called This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And it's by Nicola Perl-Roth. And it's all about how cyber attacks happen, where the vulnerabilities are, the big markets of hackers who then sell the vulnerabilities on. So if you want to understand why cyber attacks are successful, how come everybody can get into the UK medical blood system and then dump all the files online? Like, isn't somebody protecting this? Every piece of software has vulnerabilities, and this explains how cyber attacks happen, what the market is for them, who's buying them. Governments are buying them all the time. I found it super interesting, and it's very well written. So when it comes to disinformation and to cyber, those are the two books I would recommend.
Excellent. Nothing is true and everything is possible, and this is how they tell me the world ends. Two excellent recommendations for our listeners. James Appathurai, it really has been fabulous to talk through these issues, as terrifying as most of them are, but to be able to have the opportunity to talk to NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Innovation, Hybrid and Cyber has been wonderful to have you on the ASPI pod, and we are very much looking forward to having you out in Australia for the Sydney Dialogue in September. Looking forward to that and to having you on the pod once again.
Really looking forward to being there, and anytime you want to chat, it would be a great pleasure. Looking forward to seeing you.
If you're interested in finding out more about the Sydney Dialogue, we've included a link to the TSD website in your episode notes.
And that's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening.